Hi, my name's Scott, the Miniature Maniac, and today we're going to put a bow on my crystal brush series called Forgotten Paths. What up, mini family? It's been nearly a year since the part 2 of this video series, but y'all should know that regardless of time, I always finish my projects.
7 years.
I painted this piece for Crystal Brush in 2016. It took me a little bit over 200 hours to do the whole project. In part 1 of this video series, we talk about doing the non-metallic metal gold. In part 2, we talk about doing the leather and the face and the cloth of the cape. And in this part, we talk about scratch building the bow, the quiver, and also the second and final base that she eventually stands on. So without any further explanation, let's get into the build and start with the easiest part, making the bow. One caveat quickly, this video is a progression of pictures, and this will be the only video series where we only use photos. The future ones where we go over a more in-depth project like this will be done with video. The bow was built by taking a piece of brass wire and bending it to shape first, and then sculpting on what I can only describe as elven details. Make sure to roughen up the brass with some files so the putty sticks to the brass. Heck, you can even super glue it on if it gives you trouble, just don't use too much super glue. I use milliput and green stuff to do the sculpting and color shapers and some dental tools to do the shaping. In most sculpting cases, I actually mixed milliput and green stuff together to get a combination of their properties. Once it was dried, I sanded it down to give both sides a flat profile. I painted the bow like it was bone, predominantly with a cream color, making the peaks of the design elements darker with a brownish red tone. I then strung it with a string that was too thick in diameter. By this point, I really didn't care. I kind of wanted just to finish the project. There is a company called Easy Wire that makes 2-scale string that you can use. I've also heard that you can use your own hair, but I thought for a 54mm model this wouldn't have been large enough, but who knows, I never tried. For the quiver, I took some brass cylinder and cut one end on an angle and one end on a 90-degree cut. I then pinched the whole thing so it was more ovular, and then pinched one end to bring it to a close. Then I filled the gap that was fully closed, the slanted end, with some putty because a little bit of it wouldn't shut, and also added a metal rim with putty and a strap for carrying. The strap adhered with super glue. It was made by rolling out a thin cylinder of green stuff and then flattening it. Pretty simple. The milliput metal rim was again sculpted with color shapers and dental tools and then trued up with some good old sanding. The way in which I painted the non-metallic metal gold on this quiver was described in part 1 of this video series, but the quiver itself was painted with a myriad of brown tones, sponged on with others to give it a rough look. I also added some tiny scratches too, real thin with a brush. The arrows themselves were made of paperclip material with paper triangles glued to one end to simulate the feathers of the arrow. These were painted separately and then glued into the quiver. Onto the final second version display base. I started by taking a 1.5-inch piece wide of plastic card, about an inch long, to start the form of my bridge. I heated it up with a heat gun and bent it over a round form to get the general shape. I then let it cool and sanded the two edges so the bridge would sit flat on the ground. To make the slate rocks on top of the bridge, I took a piece of grease-proof paper, about the same size as the plastic card, and flattened out some milliput on top of the grease-proof paper while it was on the bridge and let it dry. While it was curing, I also pressed an actual rock into the putty to impart a rocky texture on it. What I had after this was a thin piece of milliput that was the same shape and curvature of my bridge. I could now break pieces off of this piece of milliput and they would click together nicely on the bridge and form this kind of slate-looking rock. I also wanted to make some pillars for my bridge, 3 on each side. These pillars are made with a plastic hard core and the stones are sculpted with milliput and pins are added to the bottom for installation ease. You can see how ugly the sculpt job is, but for something that's square like this, it's super easy to clean it up with some sandpaper and some triangle files. I then added nicks and dings with an X-Acto knife and triangle files. It was at this point that I realized the pillars were a little too high for my model, so I shortened them with a hobby saw. I wanted to add a handrail in between the pillars, and to do this I wanted to use something like jewelry chain that you find at Hobby Lobby. And to do this I had to have a realistic way of having the chain adhere to the rock pillars. To do this, I fashioned eye hooks from paper clips, and this was a major pain in the ass. I later found out that the mixed media art aisle in Hobby Lobby has pre-made tiny eye hooks that you can use. I could have saved myself some fingertip skin lost in the fabrication of these tiny things if I just glued them in and threaded them with the stuff that you find at Hobby Lobby. Finally, I took a look at some realistic pillars and I noticed that a lot of them have a larger capstone on top of them, so I cut a larger square out of some plasticard, dinged it up, and glued it on top. I also realized at some point that I could have probably just made 1 or 2 of these and then casted the rest of them out of resin, but I'm dumb and made all 6. At the very least, this ensures that I have 6 that look different. One problem I had with the last base was that the bridge wasn't high enough over the riverbed, so I elevated each side of the bridge by creating 2 hills, bulking up these hills with pink insulation foam. I smoothed out the hills with milliput and I also added on some flat rocks on the bottom of the bridge, which you might not be able to ever see, but I wanted to make sure there was something there in case a judge ever went looking under the bridge. I then mounted all the stuff to my plinth and smeared a lot of spackle all over the pink insulation foam to smooth out some of the details a little bit more. I also pinned and glued this awesome twig that I found in my backyard to act as a tree. Another issue I had with the last base was that the riverbed and gravel on the shore were the same granularity, so when I primed it, they looked identical. This time I used small rocks for the riverbed and I ground up some dirt from my backyard and dried it out and sieved it through a stocking to basically get a powder, and I used this as the typical dirt on the tops of the hills and also on the bridge. I've heard another good alternative is to use tile grout from your local home supply store. This can be a really good 2-scale dirt for your miniature bases and dioramas. I also lined the edge of the bridge with little brick pavers that are made from resin that I got from Secret Weapon. I cut the corners of these little things off and scratched them up to make them look more like stone. I took some roots from some small weeds that I pulled in my backyard and glued them around the bridge to give it a more ancient look, and added rocks of various size to the riverbed and glued them all down with super glue. This base is about 30% super glue. I then primed it in an undercoat of white and black and started to add colors, brown tones for the dirt, blues and greens for the riverbed, and grays for the stonework. I then passed over the stonework and dirt with a dry brush or 2 of lighter tones. I painted the chain a dark brown color and sponged on some more orange tones and rusted them up with some reddish pigments applied with some water. I also started to add some vegetation, some ivy and some cattails, various clump foliage, and leaves that I cut from actual leaves with leaf punch cutters that I found from Green Stuff World. Now came for the big resin pour. This was kind of a disaster, and unfortunately I have no pictures of the disaster, so you have to use your imagination. I shielded off the sides of the plinth with plasticard and fastened them with rubber bands. I poured the resin clear because I wanted the riverbed colors to show through. There were some bubbles in the resin that were introduced from the mixing process that I popped with some heat from a hairdryer. I then checked back in a few hours and found out that it was leaking. The edge of my terrain features were not flush with the edge of the plasticard that I was using to dam up the base, and a leak was forming in one of the corners and falling out into the tray that I had put under it. The stuff was curing super slowly and I just let it leak and kind of fill its own hole. Removing the plasticard was also an exercise in futility. I ended up ripping them off and taking some of the resin with it. Another issue was that the resin crept up the plasticard walls, meaning the riverbed wasn't flat. So I shaved off this creepage with an X-Acto knife and sanded it, and the sides of the plinth flat and flush with the terrain features. This is not when you want to be doing this, by the way, when your base is fully painted and all terrained up. I had to polish up the resin river where I shaved the creepage, I love this word by the way, with a very high grit sandpaper, and then hit it with a gloss varnish to make it look like it's nice and shiny. I then painted the featureless areas of the plinth that I sanded black and attached my miniature to it with super glue and pins. This is very clearly the wrong way to pour resin for a miniature diorama, and some of you might be wondering the right way to do it. How do you avoid resin creeping up the sides of your dams? In the description I have linked an article from Joshua Lai, the veritable pro of resin pouring in the recent past, that you can read and learn probably the right technique to do it. I then attached my miniature to the base with super glue and pins and tried to tie her more into the base with some dry pigments, adding them to her shoes and also to her cloak, and this epic journey was finally complete. Again, this model took me a long time to paint, about 250 hours. I learned a ton in the procedure, and I'm sad that I didn't do video of the process, but still happy that I can make a video about the various steps that I went through with the photography. If you like this video, I have a playlist of the other parts of this process that you can check out. Give it a thumbs up. If you want to support the channel, I sell t-shirts and stickers on my Redbubble account. You can check out various rewards I have on my Patreon account, all linked in the description below. Subscribe or die, and most importantly, don't forget to paint more minis! Made by Tiny in the dirt with a dry brush on some more orange tones.